Hi, everybody. Today's topic is called Your Strength is Your Weakness. Your weakness is your strength. Before we start, I wanted to apologize I got this circular light, and you can see my eyes and my glasses are now rings. It doesn't really matter, but I thought I'd mention it. So, as part of my study, I went to the Foundation for A Course in Miracles in Roscoe. Back then it was in Roscoe. And the staff there held weekly groups on various topics. And each of them entailed some kind of an exercise. And one of them was to write down our strengths and our weaknesses. Once done, we were asked to apply the following thought to all of them. And the thought is, your strengths are your weaknesses, and your weaknesses are your strengths. It was a very interesting exercise, and I really had never thought about it this way until we did that exercise. And over the years, I just kept going back to it, thinking about it more. It turns out that this is just one of the many instances where the Course completely turns our thinking literally upside down. The Course says here, for example, in the text chapter 13, section 5, your manifestations of emotions are the opposite of what the emotions are. And then in chapter 19, section 2, it says, it can indeed be said the ego made its world on sin. Only in such a world could everything be upside down. The Course mentions this upside down thinking throughout, and what we think is one thing is actually a completely other thing, namely its opposite. What we think is love, for example, is actually hate. What we believe is strong is weakness. And what we believe is outside is on the inside. And most importantly, what we believe is truth is actually the opposite of truth, which is illusion. So this exercise works on a few different levels, and it also entails a couple of steps. And in order to explore this further, let's go back for a minute or so, to the metaphysical background of the Course. So think of it this way. Heaven and truth have no counterpart, right? Because this is not a non-dualistic thought system. There is no opposite to truth, because truth is all-encompassing. There cannot be an opposite to truth. The reality is one. Love is unified, and God knows no opposites. God, love, oneness, truth is all the same. So when this tiny mad idea that the Course talks about arose, or seemingly arose, in the mind of God's Son, there were basically two diametrically opposed reactions to this idea. And one was the Holy Spirit, that said it's basically just impossible to separate from God, and that ended the whole thing. The other one is from the ego, and that said it is possible to separate from our source. So at this moment, the part of the Son of God, the splintered off part of the Son of God, that has now those two diametrically opposed thought systems as a choice, turns away from the Holy Spirit and chooses the ego. And the thought of separation, as the Course says, did become a serious idea and possible of both accomplishments and real effects. That's in chapter 27, section 8. So, within the framework of this chapter, of this segment, it's important to note that everything in the illusion is the opposite of truth, not from the perspective of the truth, but from the perspective of the illusion, everything that has been done inside the illusion has to be the opposite of truth. The thought system of the ego and everything that comes with it, including the belief in sin, in guilt, in fear, projection, and the world, all of it is the opposite of truth. For example, if truth is light, the ego has to be darkness. It can't be light because the ego was made as the opposite of darkness. It can't have a little bit of light in it. The ego thought system is 100% darkness. There's no light at all. If God is wholeness, then everything within the ego thought system must be lacking. There cannot be something within the ego thought system that isn't lacking. Lack penetrates the whole thought system of the ego. Everything on this side is lack. There is no wholeness in the ego thought system. Sometimes it appears that way, but it's important to realize that there is no wholeness in the ego thought system. If truth is eternal, then the ego thought system must be ephemeral, right? If God is changeless, the ego must be a thought system of constant change. Again, there can't be a little bit of changelessness in the ego thought system. It's either changelessness or permanent change, always changing, always in flux. There cannot be a constant within the ego thought system. And as God is all-encompassing love, the ego thought system must be its opposite, namely fragmented and fragmenting fear. That is all there is in here. Fragmented and fragmenting, constantly fragmenting fear. That's all the ego thought system is. So once the ego thought system was born, quote unquote, we as the separated Son of God believed the ego that told us of our sin of having murdered God, right? That's the basis of the ego thought system. The ego became our ally, and our agreement now with it included the following items. First, we needed to get rid of this overwhelming and all-encompassing guilt that we felt over having killed God, according to the ego. Second, we needed to somehow alleviate that gaping hole that now existed within us. And it stemmed from having completely obliterated the memory of God. Right? The memory of God is now gone. So those are the items we have bargained with the ego. The ego wants us to choose it. And we want the ego to get rid of our guilt and to take care of this gaping hole inside. And we both agreed to not let the other person down. And we swore in blood, as the Course says, never to abandon the ego from that point forward. So we made the world literally from our guilt. We now live in a body with a life, quote unquote. And we have three basic goals in this world, right? There are no other goals in this world than this. First, to keep the separation intact. Second, to get rid of our guilt and the sin that causes it. And third, to somehow deal with this longing inside that we still have, that we can't figure out what that is. So we split off this belief in guilt, in sin and guilt, right? We completely forget that it exists within us. We project it outward into the world now. And secondly, we are in constant search of a substitute for love. Those are the two purposes, the two goals of this world. Once the separation is confirmed, In order not to look at the separation again, the ego tells us we're sinful and we have lost God and we have murdered God. So we have to counteract those beliefs. And the ego provides ample opportunity to do that in the world. So searching for a substitute for love and projecting our guilt outward, obviously, if you look at it straight on, cannot make us happy. Nothing in here can make us happy, right? This is a place of unhappiness. If the heaven is joy, the ego must be its opposite, which is misery. There can't be a little bit of joy in here. The only joy that the ego gets us to experience is the fading joy of the special relationship that is very short-lived. So, one of the ways for the ego to solve our problem of inadequacy, the inadequacy comes from our belief in sin, right? How can we not feel inadequate if we believe we are, as the Course says in lesson 93, the home of evil, darkness, and sin? How can we not feel inadequate deep, deep down? The ego says, okay, let's split this inadequacy off, project it outside. It's outside of you, fine. Now, I will help you develop characteristics that will counteract that feeling. Keep it at the low, right? Keep it down. For example, we become strong in the world, right? Or we become educated in the world. Or we become intelligent or powerful in the world. We learn to perhaps become steadfast in our actions, principled, maybe good-natured. We become loyal or helpful or successful. We become masters in our field. Any characteristics the world would judge as positive and good have as their goal, among others, to keep the pain of our mediocre existence at bay. And mediocre means we're pushing down that sin, inadequate, right? We're pushing down that sin and that guilt that is in our subconscious now, but it's always bubbling up. It's always bubbling up. And we have to find a way to deal with that inadequacy. I remember Ken talked about at some point about we feel like a second-class citizen, right? Because of this sin and this guilt that we believe in. We must feel inadequate. So this inadequacy is painted over by all those positive attributes that we learn through our lives, right? The more, the better. If we are strong enough, for example, to overcome hardship, we're seen as a hero in the world. The ego loves if we overcome hardship, because if there's hardship, the ego is real, problems are real. And more importantly, there's somebody that is causing this hardship. So that means the moment we are experiencing hardship in the ego, we are a victim. That means we're innocent. That means we have successfully gotten rid of this sin and guilt that we believe in, right? So all of those positive traits that we develop over the course of our lives are their only purpose, if we're in the ego thought system, which for now we are there to adapt to the firm belief in sin. All of our strengths are there to push down that feeling of inadequacy that is there, very much there. Because if we don't look at the sin and the guilt that is the layer of defense above the separation, we will never get rid of it. We have to look at it with Jesus and the Holy Spirit in order to bring this to the surface so it doesn't have any power anymore. Right now, it has tremendous power because it makes us feel inadequate. We don't even know how and why we feel that way. And this inadequacy we try to overcome with positive traits. None of this is conscious, right? We have no idea that this is happening. We're happy of our positive traits, right? We're happy that we're smart or any of the positive characteristics. We work hard, maybe. So the positive characteristics, the positive traits are there for our protection, to keep the individuality intact, right? While keeping sin and guilt away and while keeping God at bay. We want to keep God at bay. So we're being a good person. We said in a couple of segments before that God hunts the innocent. God hunts the guilty. So we want to turn that guilt around and make something positive with our lives so that God can't find us, right? That's a pretty sad image, but this is what we have to look at, because this is the whole ego thought system that we have bought. Hook, line, and sinker, 100% we have bought this ego thought system, right? And Jesus' job in the Course is to layer by layer make us familiar with this ego thought system so that whatever is in the subconscious comes up into the conscious mind, and then we can reevaluate it with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and eventually choose against it and choose the Holy Spirit. But before this can happen, we must look at all of that ego thought system. And our positive traits are definitely a very good defense against first our guilt and then love. So we believe strength is a good thing, for example. And the above exercise that the initial exercise of this segment, your weakness is your strength and your strength is your weakness, shows, or it's there for us to consider that we might be wrong with our evaluation, right? That strengths are our strength. That all those positive traits, those are strengths. And it says here in the Course, to learn this Course requires willingness to question every value that you hold. Not some values, not one, not 99% of the values. Over time, in our process with the Course, Jesus asks us to question every value. And each positive trait that we own is a value that we hold against the light. Each value that we hold that is a positive trait about us keeps the ego intact. For now. This is not where it ends up, but this is part of the process of looking at all those positive traits and realize they might not be as positive as we thought, because they cover the guilt, which then in turn covers the love. So our positive traits are a substitute for the love of God that we think we lost. So let's talk about the weaknesses. Let's say some of our weaknesses include that we're not a leader, we're a follower, or that we're not assertive in the world. Let's just say one of them. Perhaps we do what we're being told without question, or we're indecisive, maybe moody, maybe challenged in some way. Maybe we're not disciplined when it comes to anything like studying or exercising. Whatever our weaknesses are, they can be our strengths, depending on how we look at them. For example, if we are following rather than leading, the world would judge that as, yeah, you're a follower. We would prefer a leader in general, right? However, if we are more of a follower, we would be more inclined to seek out Jesus or the Holy Spirit for guidance, right? Because if we are already a follower, it'll be a little bit easier for us to follow Jesus rather than somebody who's a born leader. For a born leader, to then say, I'm going to follow Jesus is much harder than for somebody that is already doesn't want to lead, might have a little bit less of a hard time finding or taking the hand of Jesus to lead him or her. If we haven't developed a very strong persona in the world yet, or maybe we never do, we're kind of in the background, watching people rather than, I would say introvert maybe. I don't know if this is the right word. But we might be more willing to question who we are than somebody who has a fully developed persona in the world. So the main reason for this exercise is basically to loosen our strong belief in what traits are good and what traits are bad. This isn't where we're going to end up, but this is a definite step. So we go through the exercise, we write down all of our strengths, we write down all of our weaknesses, and we think about them with regard to what we just discussed before, right? The weaknesses, the strengths could be or are most likely a major defense against the love. The weaknesses too, right? We're gonna get to that now. But in general, the first part of this exercise is for us to realize that the weaknesses aren't necessarily weaknesses, and strengths aren't necessarily strengths. It's just about what he says in chapter 16, section 6. The urgency is only in dislodging your mind from its fixed position here. This will not leave you homeless and without a frame of reference. Sometimes it looks that way. Sometimes it feels that way because we're kind of rattled. Once we go through this exercise and really look at all of our positive traits, it's not an easy thing to do because our whole foundation of our life might depend on those traits, right? What are we without those traits? What are we without doing good for people? Who are we? So we lose our identity, and losing the identity, we're getting close to the bottom, the foundation of the ego thought system. The ego is absolutely terrified of that we lose our identity, because if we lose our identity, we're very close to realizing, wait a minute, I might have another identity, which is over here, right? If we have a very well set identity in the ego thought system, very hard to change over. If we have a kind of a wobbly identification with something in here, in this world, we might be a little bit easier for us to go to the other side. So this is similar to the process of forgiveness. The first step is always to become aware of what we're doing or thinking. So the first step in the above exercise is to become aware of our current belief concerning our strengths and weaknesses, right? Tell it like it is. Don't spiritualize the strengths or the weaknesses. Write them down as clearly and as unambiguous as they are. I think I am smart. Maybe I can adapt to situations. Maybe I'm a good runner. Maybe I'm good at sports. Maybe I'm good at remembering things. I'm good with people. Versus weaknesses. I feel I just live day by day. I don't have goals. I don't have motivation to study or anything. So write it all down, and then realize the strength is not the weakness, and the weakness is not the strength. The strength might be a weakness, and the weakness might be a strength. The second step is the acknowledgement that we put those traits, either one, good or bad, there for a reason. The traits are purposive. The purpose, as mentioned above, is to keep the separation going and to counteract our deep belief in sin. Step 3 is to question that purpose and what our traits are for. And the workbook says, the workbook lesson number 25, I do not know what anything is for. This lesson If we were to really think about any of the lessons, we would be in absolute terror. But if you think about, I do not know what anything is for. I do not know what my good traits or my bad traits are for. That's a scary thought. If we follow that thought, it's a very, very scary thought, because we're basically questioning the foundation of our lives. So step 3, that's why step 3, to question that purpose, we have to do it with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, right? I mean, it's always good to ask Jesus and the Holy Spirit for help from the beginning of the exercise. Okay, Jesus, I'm writing down all my strengths. Please help me. So we're staying in contact with this side, right? This gets really dark if we really look at it. So we need to establish a relationship with this side in order to look at this without being traumatized, right? So once we have opened our own use of our traits to question, the Holy Spirit and Jesus can use those traits for the good of the sonship. At that point, they become neutral. Once we look at the positive and the negative charged traits with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they lose their charge. They become neutral. They're no longer used to keep sin from us, to keep the separation intact, and to cover up that inadequacy, right? Once we looked at that, they become neutral. That's a process. It doesn't happen tomorrow. It doesn't happen the first time we look at those traits, but over time, we realize that those traits, they lose their charge, and the charge is always guilt. That's what makes everything in our lives heavy. The guilt that comes from the belief in sin, that we have killed God. Once we look at that with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, they become neutral, those traits. And the Course says, such is the Holy Spirit's kind perception of specialness. Specialness is our special traits. At that point, his use of what you made to heal instead of harm. We used our traits to harm ourselves, because they covered up this inadequacy. And covering up inadequacy means we're keeping inadequacy alive. If we remove those and let the inadequacy come up, let the sin and guilt come up, and look at it again with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, it will dispel, it will dissolve, because it is not real other than through our belief in it. So we made our characteristics to keep the separation intact and to adapt to the belief that sin is real. This is harmful to us, as I just explained. And looking at the characteristics with Jesus and the Holy Spirit, which means questioning the purpose that they served, until then allows that purpose to be changed from being harmful to being helpful and healing. So, once we realize that our weaknesses and our strengths are both neutral, we can then realize, and that's really a big part. That's why we can't skip steps. We can't go to this step without what we just discussed. This step is our real weakness is our belief in the ego thought system. Our real strength is that part of our mind that connects us with God, with Christ, right? Vision, the miracle, same interests, Jesus, forgiveness. That is our real strength. Our real weakness is everything that comes from the ego thought system. But in order for this to find root in our mind, right? Like a root in a glass of water, the roots come up, It has to have roots first before you plant it into the soil. If you just put the plant into the soil, usually nothing happens. So it has to get some roots, and the roots come from looking at what we just described, looking at our traits. If we try to go and say, "Oh yeah, I'm strong in the world," that's ego. I'm going to the Holy Spirit. Those are just words, right? They are lip service to Jesus. Say, "Oh, I'm doing the course," right? Look how often I can go to the Holy Spirit. Jesus doesn't care how often we go to the Holy Spirit. He cares about how often we look at the ego with him. That's what he cares about. He doesn't care about our yes to God. What he wants from us is the no. No, I'm not going to go to God. I like Stefan. I like that he's smart. I'm not going to go and question that and go to the Holy Spirit. That's what he wants. That's what he wants to bring to him, right? Wants us to bring to him. So if we skip over everything we just discussed in the last 30 minutes and go straight to that thinking that says our real weakness is our belief in the ego and our real strength is this, we get something out of it. And this can always be part of the process, but we can't forget that first part. To become aware of that subconscious, that unconscious mind that believes those traits are real and we need them to cover up our inadequacy. Then if we forget the inadequacy, we push them outward. Now everybody else is inadequate and we're the strong ones, we're the good-hearted ones. We do good things in the world. We have non-profit foundations. None of this is bad, but if it's done with the ego, which originally most likely it is, it covers up our belief in sin and guilt, and this is what we have to look at, right? So once we're looking at that, we'll go to the next step, which is to realize the strength lies here and the weakness lies in the ego thought system. And how can we get in touch with our real strength? Very simple. Not easy, but very simple. We look at our weakness with Jesus, and that brings us into our strength, right? That is always the process. And Ken always said, being in your right mind is being in your wrong mind without judgment. And that is always the process of the course. So as a closing, I want to read something from lesson 92. Lesson 92 talks about the weakness here and the strength here, right? So in this lesson, in a way, we have already, or that is kind of the second phase of that, right? That we have already looked at our strengths and weaknesses in this world, and they are now neutral, and now we can realize this is our real weakness and this is our real strength. So this is where Jesus comes from when we read those two paragraphs. It says here, this is lesson 92. I think it's paragraph 3 and 4. It says, "It is God's strength in you that is the light in which you see, as it is his mind with which you think. His strength denies your weakness." His strength denies your weakness. "It is your weakness that sees through the body's eyes, peering about in darkness, to behold the likeness of itself." That's what we project. "The small, the weak, the sickly, and the dying, those in need, the helpless and afraid, the sad, the poor, the starving, and the joyless." Anything we see through the ego's eyes gives us exactly that picture, and that is us pushed down and projected outward. That is that inadequacy that we're pushing down and projecting outward, and then we're seeing it outside in the weak, the sickly and the dying, those in need, the helpless and afraid, the sad, the poor, the starving, and the joyless. We see ourselves in them because we're seeing through the eyes of the ego. It says, these are seen through eyes that cannot see and cannot bless. Strength overlooks these things by seeing past appearances. This is the strength of the Holy Spirit. Do not attempt to do that on your own. We cannot attempt to do this on our own. If we try to see through what we see, the poor, the sad, the starving, and the joyless, we try to do that ourselves and say, oh no, those are the sons of God. Again, that is absolutely meaningless. That's not what Jesus is talking about, right? That is what he says here. Strength overlooks these things by seeing past experiences. It keeps its steady gaze upon the light that lies beyond them. That is strength. That is the Holy Spirit. We can't just switch over. If that would be possible, we would have done it already, right? So it's a little bit more difficult because our life, we think, depends on keeping the ego fully intact and forgetting the Holy Spirit. So for us to just go over here and say, oh yeah, I can just look through all this that I see and go to the Holy Spirit's vision, it's not working. It is not working. It can't work. The whole course is set up to explain to us that this cannot work, right? There's always a process involved. And the process is what we just talked about until now. So strength overlooks these things by seeing past appearances. It keeps its steady gaze upon the light that lies beyond them. It unites with light of which it is a part. It sees itself. So if we switch over to Jesus for one instant, and sometimes that happens, sometimes our defenses are down, and for 1 second at the register in the supermarket or somewhere we're driving a car or we're doing dishes, all of a sudden, we realize we switch over and we see through the Holy Spirit and everything becomes beautiful, right? Everybody becomes dear to us. It unites with light of which it is a part. It sees itself. We're seeing it ourselves. Just like we see ourselves when we look through with the ego, we see ourselves when we look through the Holy Spirit. It brings the light in which your self appears. In darkness, you perceive a self that is not there. All those traits, strengths and weaknesses, that is a self that we have created that is not there. Strength is the truth about you. Weakness is an idol falsely worshipped and adored, that strength may be dispelled and darkness rule where God appointed that there should be light. So, interesting that this little exercise that we did there, if you really follow it through the steps, it opens up a much bigger frame of reference for us to look through, right? It's not just about that our weakness is our strength and our strength is our weakness. That's the very beginning, and then it goes further and further, and then we realize this is our true weakness and this is our true strength. And the process of getting to the strength is to look at the weakness without sugarcoating it and asking our strength, Jesus and the Holy Spirit, for help. That's it. See you next time.